Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernicuse, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program concludes our conversation with Hugh Starkey, Emeritus Professor of Citizenship and Human Rights Education at the IOE Faculty of Education, University College of London in the United Kingdom. In this episode, Hugh Starkey discusses the roles which school administrators can play in advancing children's rights education, the conceptual and practical linkages between social justice and the fields of global citizenship and human rights education, how educators can deploy human rights education in response to violations of the rights of migrants, how human rights education can respond to the threats posed by rising authoritarianism across the globe, the individuals who have inspired him in his work in human rights education, and his recommendations for advancing human rights and global citizenship education going forward. Do you see the same level of commitment in school leadership as you do among teachers? For one of the issues that I see in this country is that school administrators have virtually no understanding of human rights, whether it's the Universal Declaration or the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Do you see that in Europe?
Certainly one does, but on the other hand, we also see inspiring school leaders who very much embrace children's rights, human rights, and enact them within their schools. I'm governor of a primary school in the city where I live, and we have a very participatory feel to the school. The children love being there, the parents like it, yes. So the other, I think the reasons why school administrators have been less favourable to human rights has been that there have been attempts by educational authorities to restrict the curriculum, to make it very basic reading and so on, to exclude and I know in the States this is going on at the moment, but in a very political way, to exclude certain subjects, to impose certain subjects, and so on. And the school administrators feel that they don't have much agency. So where school administrators can find that they have agency, then they can enact models of education, models of schooling that can be, I think, transformative.
Well, I would say that you're right in terms of the efforts by elected officials to impose restraints, constraints, censorship, however you want to call it. But the interesting thing to me and what you just said is that it seems that if you have an understanding of things like the CRC or the UDHR, at least you've taken the first step. And I think that's where the United States, because it has such a decentralized system of education, it's not something that can be handed down from Washington, for example. It's a grassroots effort in every state.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Yeah.
No. That's fine. Yeah.
Now, shifting gears again, I'd like you to talk about this concept of social justice. Now, this term has been used a lot for many different things. I don't think there's necessarily a common definition. So what do you see as the connection between social justice, global citizenship, and human rights education? Do you see as a nexus there?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. So I have illustrated this with reference to the work of Malcolm X, actually, and the civil rights struggle. And Malcolm X, towards the end of his life, started going around the world. He went to Egypt and so on, and he discovered human rights. And he came back and started making speeches and saying, if you just call it civil rights, then you'll find that those same people who oppressed you before, they will continue to oppress you. If you call it human rights, anyone, anywhere can be your ally. And it's the fact that these are universal standards, and that you can recognize struggles for justice, and your own struggle for justice can be mirrored in huge number of other different contexts, and this would be the bottom-up movement of human rights. I with Stephen Hopgood, he teaches, he's a professor at SOAS University of London, and he wrote a book called The End Times of Human Rights, and he distinguishes between human rights with a capital H and a capital R, and human rights lowercase. And human rights, capital H, capital R, is an institution. There are institutions. It's the United Nations. It's Amnesty International. It's all these other legal frameworks. It's the European Court of Human Rights. It's the International Criminal Court, and so on. And in that forum, nation states vie with each other and try and kind of insult each other. We're better at this than you, and you find that the Chinese ambassador at the United Nations pointing out that there's still racial discrimination in the USA and the American, and so on. So there is kind of slanging match across human rights, and that gets human rights, capital H, capital R, a bad name. But there's this other thing that's human rights, and that's what ordinary people understand by human rights and have developed over the years. This is grassroots human rights, and as you say, it can come from bottom up. I go along with René Cassin, who said that the law, it's all very well, but it can only ever be a backstop. The important thing is to build a culture of human rights, and where it's unthinkable to abuse human rights. And so, yes, human rights with lowercase as a grassroots movement. This is a very, very powerful ideology, and all over the world. I mean, apartheid was defeated by reference to human rights. The African National Congress in 1954 said all must have their human rights. And across the world, where there is oppression, people come together and demand freedoms and human rights. They can be pushed down, of course, all the time, but this is a very, very powerful idea that people can just take and use to support their particular struggles.
So in terms of justice, when people use the term social justice, do you see that as equivalent to human rights with the lowercase?
Social justice is the aim, isn't it? So the aim of human rights, as we say in the Universal Declaration, is freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That's the aim. Human rights is the means. It's the way to get there. By universal respect for human rights, you can then achieve things like social justice. So we all need a utopia, which is a vision of the world as it might be, and human rights provides that utopia, and we can work towards that vision, knowing that we may get knocked back, there will be setbacks, but nonetheless, we've got a vision. We know where we want to go. We can organize strategically around that to achieve things like social justice.
Well, you mentioned Malcolm X, and I also think Martin Luther King, just before he died, had actually shifted his focus quite a bit to social and economic rights.
Yes.
I mean, that last effort on his part in Memphis was dealing precisely with that, the Poor
Indeed.
People's Campaign.
Yeah. They're
So
very important.
let me raise a very specific issue that you're dealing with in the UK. And of course, I think it's a worldwide issue, but I know politically it's a very contentious one in the UK, and that is the issue of migrant rights.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point in time, that has become a flashpoint, not only in the UK, but in the United States and in other countries. How would you deploy human rights education to address that conflict very specifically?
Yeah. Well, so one of the key concepts of human rights is human dignity. And so in terms of migrants, the major thing, the starting point has got to be, these are human beings with dignity. And so what we must counteract is any attempt to dehumanize them. So even calling them refugees or immigrants and so on may be the start of a dehumanizing process. You then get other words attached, so illegal migrants and so on. So illegal asylum seekers, suggesting that they don't have any entitlement. But in any case, it's vitally important that anyone within the ambit of a government is treated with respect, with dignity, is subject to due process, and so on. And this has been sadly lacking, particularly given conservative governments, I would say, but I'm not sure that the social democratic governments have necessarily done all that much better.
So if I were going to advise someone about how to actually take a program in human rights education and deploy it to deal with that issue, would you say that it's something that had to be left to every individual teacher, or do you think there are certain principles that have to be employed in the classroom to deal with it?
Okay, well, so principles such as human dignity, equality, and principles of democracy, that is to say, fair distribution of communication and so on. So one of my doctoral students working in Greece did a project deliberately to help her Greek students be more sympathetic to migrants. That migrants had come in. She knew there was a lot of hostility towards them amongst teachers, and the children were also getting it. So she found that the Council of Europe had produced some excellent materials of exercises one can do in the classroom, and she deployed a number of these and worked with classes. She also enabled some of the migrant students who were in a holding centre, enabled them to come to the classroom and meet the other children. So this contact theory she found that it was relatively effective as a way of helping, getting the parents agreement to the program, getting them on board. And so there are things that you can do. And as I say, that there are materials out there. The Council of Europe has them. And I would say yes, it would be important for educational authorities to encourage this, but that might be hard to guarantee, really. So probably individual teachers will have to do it.
Right. So now we're at it's 2024. The Universal Declaration has been around for 75 years. Children's Rights Convention has been around for 35 years. But we have these real challenges of authoritarianism in the world, which in many ways, as I see it, counter or challenge the principles in those documents. What do you see as a path forward in human rights education or global citizenship to try to deal with these authoritarian threats?
Okay, so I think the first thing, the first principle, as I previously said, is a right isn't a right unless you know about it. And once you do know about it, then it can become a powerful idea. So the first step really is to make sure that human rights are known about. Now, I mean, in the old Soviet Union, they used to have things called samizdat, as I recall, kind of secret pieces of paper that people would hand around with these dangerous ideas. So maybe in some situations that actually human rights is quite considered a dangerous idea, and people may have to do it covertly. But then I have found that even so, as I mentioned, I've had Chinese students as my doctoral students. I've been to China many times and have been able to do human rights education in Chinese universities. Even institutes of Marxism intrigued. What is this thing, human rights? Come and tell us about it. And so I've lectured, done workshops, and so on. So even in unpromising circumstances, it is often possible to find spaces where you can discuss these things. All I can hope is that there will be sufficient knowledge of human rights out there that when the political situation eases up, people will know what the next step is, what they want to do, and what the principles by which they're going to react to that will be, I suppose.
Now, that's an interesting idea, because I think that some people would argue that, okay, we can do underground newspapers, but we can also go to jail. And so there's a risk. So I want to shift it over to one other option, and that is the idea of popular education, because that would exist potentially outside of the formal school system. Do you see that as having potential?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I was kind of implying that also. Yes, that people can organize outside this. In fact, probably you have to if you're in a very authoritarian regime. And the school system gives you absolutely no space to consider these things, then. But I mean, a lot of work is done in, let's say, in churches. They're places where people can discuss human rights. Mosques. I mean, but also, I imagine. I mean, that there must be other kinds of societies and structures and loose structures. Well, trade unions, obviously, would be another place where these kind of things happen. If there is scope for other political parties, then obviously within those political parties, you work on policies based on human rights. So it may be dangerous, and there are those regimes that are so oppressive that it is dangerous. But even within those regimes, in Nazi Germany, people found ways of discussing alternatives and organizing themselves. No regime is so far has been had total absolute power. There are often spaces that you can find.
And I think that the experience in Latin America particularly shows
Yes.
that those popular movements had an impact.
Yes.
In Latin America have demonstrated that. So I think you're right. There's always a space. The question is how effective you can use it.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
Well, let me turn to our last three questions, which I ask of every person who comes on the podcast. The first one is, who would be the most influential role model for your work in human rights education and in global citizenship?
Okay. Am I allowed three, actually?
Hey, tell me as many as you want.
Okay, so I picked on three. I picked on John Dewey because of his role of his philosophy of education for democracy, based on communication, and that very much resonates with my experience as a language teacher and so on, and is the basis for all the pedagogical work. The second one would be René Cassin. I've already mentioned his view that he was a lawyer. He helped draw up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and said that actually this is only a backup, that it's actually building the culture of human rights that is so important. And my third would be Eleanor Roosevelt. Where do universal rights begin? In small places, close to home, so small that you can't find them on a map, something like that. And those three together have inspired my work very profoundly.
So, is there a quote that most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights education and or global citizenship?
Well, I have fished out a quote, yes. And actually, it comes from the Preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Just a beautiful summing up of all the elements: human dignity, inherent dignity, equal rights, inalienable rights, they can't be taken away, members of the human family, seeing all human beings as part of a family. And this is respect for that is the foundation of, this is then our utopia: freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That's where we're hoping to go.
I think it's very important what you said earlier too, and that is you have to have an ideal to strive for. And I think that quote really sort of makes that concrete, does it?
It gives all the key words there. You could spend years just exploring that quote and the different elements of it. That would give you a whole human rights course to go through all that. But yes, it's an inspiring quote. Yeah.
And the last question is, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education and global citizenship, what would that be?
Okay, well, I think I have to say that it would be to ensure that all teacher education courses had a compulsory and assessed module on human rights and children's rights. I think that would be the most powerful way of ensuring that knowledge of human rights was disseminated.
Well, I think it's interesting that you added assessed because, for example, I teach a course at Rutgers when it's offered as an elective
Right.
on human rights education, but not every student who wants to be a teacher has to take it. So that sort of diminishes its impact, I would say. What you're saying, as I understand it, is that you want it to be compulsory and that they have to demonstrate understanding. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes. That they can't actually qualify as a teacher without having shown satisfactory acquiring of knowledge, skills, and so on about human rights and for human rights. Yeah.
If you wanted to do that in the United Kingdom, what would be your first step to get that done?
Well, but it would have to come from the government. It would have to be so the government instructing the university. Right. It would be about the qualification of teachers. I'm really no longer an expert in the way that system works, but there would have to be. I mean, clearly there are teacher standards that the Department for Education imposes. So if one of the teacher standards was that you have to have adequate knowledge of human rights, then you could do it that way. So it would have to come through anyway, ministerial. Whether it would require legislation or not, I don't know. Hopefully, it could just be done by ministerial decree, but that might make it easy to undo, I suppose.
And if that would happen, you'd have to have many more people like you who would be able to train those teachers, right?
Well, that's of course, yes, but I'm not just doing it for my own job prospects. In fact, it's rather late for that.
No, I mean that there would have to be a real effort to provide education and training for people who would then become teacher trainers, right?
Absolutely. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Because that's a major deficit in the United States. We've had a lot of conversations in Human Rights Educators USA about that problem.
Yeah. That's crucial.
Well, Hugh, it has been a real pleasure to have you today on our conversation about so many important topics, and I thank you very much for being with us.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, and I always enjoy talking about human rights education, and it helps me clarify my position and makes it easier the next time I'm talking, because I have clearer ideas. So thank you for helping me to do that.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gotha. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.